Yes, I'm Brent Olson, loss control. I go out and do the meetings with folks in the Washington Hospitality Association and assist them with their performance when we see that they're having issues related to injuries on the job. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is things that I have gleaned from my meetings with employers just like yourselves out on site. Like John mentioned repeatedly, the least expensive claim to manage is the one that you prevent. So that's why safety is so important because you can bypass all the claims management, return to work part of claims if you just prevent the injury in the first place. So having a great safety program is going to be paramount to having that work. So the things I'm going to talk about, why safety is important, most frequent injuries in the hospitality industry, one injury causation theory. There are many, but this is one. And then some prevention and leadership strategies. And then number 5 is actually going to be passed over to John as far as steps to take after an injury or incident occurs. So why is safety so important other than the bottom line, money? Because we all want to go home, and preferably the way that we came to work. So if you came with 5 or 10 fingers and 10 toes, you want to send everybody home the same way. There are a lot of injuries that happen on the job that change people's lives forever, and you want to prevent that. So a lot of times, as humans, we look at how events affect just ourselves. It's just human nature. But I wanted to also point out the way that an injury can affect the employee, not just the employer. So what are some of the costs associated with an injury on the job to an employee? Obviously physical pain. Nobody wants to go through getting hurt on the job. It's not fun. Lost wages. So even if someone's on workers' compensation, they're getting paid through the state, it's still gonna be not their full salary amounts. So I believe it's somewhere around 60% when they're on workers' comp. So there's a loss of earning there. Temporary or permanent disability. So I don't know about any of you, but I personally don't go to work just because I love working. I mean, I do have a good time, but I work to make money to pay for my hobbies and spend time with my friends and family and things like that. And if you get hurt and you're laid up in the hospital or you're laid up at home, you can't do those things. So reduced quality of life and depression. So I went to a conference a while back where L&I Claims Group was having a discussion, and one of the things that's really stuck with me is they talked about how on the claims floor at L&I, they have every desk that has a bright neon pink card stock, 8x11. And occasionally you see the card pop up out of the cubes and the supervisor runs over. They're trained to raise that card up in the air when they get a phone call from an employee or a person that's threatening to kill themselves on the phone. And this happens every week, a couple times depending on things that are going on. So these injuries that are occurring, whatever they are, cuts all the way to strains and strains, amputations, things like that, are having these serious impacts on these people. They're frustrated, probably even more than you are as far as dealing with a claim, because it's a difficult process. The cost to the employer, so obviously loss of productivity in business if you're losing an employee for a certain amount of time, increased industrial insurance premiums, increased liability insurance costs, and costs associated with training a replacement worker. So depending on the level of expertise for your employee that you're trying to replace, you can be from $10,000 to I've heard statistics up to $100,000 for certain types of employees to get them fully up and trained and on their way as far as costs associated with that. So there's a lot of back-end costs that not just the claim. So this is a graph that Liberty Mutual puts out every couple of years, and it talks about the top 10 causes and direct costs of the most disabling U.S. workplace injuries. And I put this up here because a lot of employers will say, well, I run a restaurant or I run a hotel. I'm not operating a sawmill. I'm not dealing with huge caustic chemicals. The very largest, most prevalent cause of disabling workplace injuries is overexertions. And it's almost double anything else. So lifting, pushing, pulling, those things, back injuries can be devastating to people. But this is basically just to say it's happening everywhere. It's not just in industrial workplaces. It's, hotels, restaurants, grocery stores, everywhere. Falls to the same level. So that's the second leading cause is slips, trips, and falls. Wet floors, slippery floors, clutter on the floor, things like that. That's falls to a lower level, so that might be things like roofing. But then you go struck by an object or equipment. So that's pulling things down off of shelves or people running into people with items. I can't tell you how many places I go in and I see these precarious shelves of heavy pots and boxes are crushed and they're tilted and about to fall over on people. And those are real hazards. And then the last one on this chart that I'll talk about is other exertions or bodily reactions. That's just basically your body failing you. You step out of a stair and your knee twists and you just have an injury that way. You're doing what you normally would do, but your body just has an injury. But all these things can happen on any work site, and there are things that we can do to prevent them, at least try to prevent them. So what are the most common injuries for your type of workplace? We have an acronym that we use, COST-B, cuts, overexertions, slips, trips, and burns. So if you look at most employers in the hospitality industry, whether it's restaurants or hotels, if you go through and graph all their injuries, at least 75% of your injuries are going to fall into that category. There's going to be a few that, outliers, but for the most part, that's going to be the most frequent and the most costly. So a few things that we can do to help prevent injuries in these types of areas. So I'll start with cuts. So I go out into restaurants and hotels, and I've talked with back of the house chefs, and I used to try to say you should wear cut gloves when you're cutting things, and I would get laughs and eye rolls and things like that because a chef never wants to wear a cut glove, and I get that. They're trained, they do what they do, and actually you don't see nearly as many cuts from the chef cutting as you do other activities using knives. So I tell people you could at least have the cut gloves available, and there are certain activities that would be great to use them. Washing the knives, cleaning your slicer. I can't tell you how many injuries I see just because people are trying to clean the slicer. Picking up glass, using a cut glove to do that. I see a lot of people just knife training in general. I can't tell you how many times I've read that somebody left a knife on the counter, bumped it, tried to catch it, and they caught it. And they caught it with the tip of it. It cuts their hand or stabs into their hand. So knife training about placing a knife where it's supposed to be after it's been used. Don't dump a knife into a sink full of water and other things because people can't see it and they reach in and they grab it. Simple activities, simple training for the activities of the using the knives. Cut gloves when you're using the mandolins. Those are really nasty injuries. And they're simple. So having those cut gloves available will at least allow people the option to use them. You as the employer should be, trying to get them to use it as often as possible. So, so overexertion injuries, depending on your industry, there are a few different things you can do. So, training people to lift properly is obviously the easiest one. Doing team lifts on heavy items, having the proper equipment. So you see people using that have kegs, trying to manhandle a keg by yourself through a tight, narrow quarters in the back of a kitchen is not fun. So either team lifting or having a keg dolly. I tell everybody, use carts for as much as you can. There's no reason to be carrying almost anything. You can fit. They have carts for all types of terrain as far as getting through doorways and things like that, and thresholds. They have large wheeled carts, small wheeled carts. They even have carts that raise and lower depending on the weight on them, so you're not having to bend over as far. I worked with one hotel who they had a lot of injuries in the rooms with housekeeping, and they had a concern that they weren't always truthful injuries. So they started doing team cleaning where they had 2 people in the rooms. So not only were they having 2 people that helped lift, but then having that second pair of eyes in there helped for any concerns they had about non-legitimate claims. So But there are a lot of different things. They make tools that you can slide underneath a mattress that help. They're spring loaded. They help raise the mattress up. Barely any pressure will bring it up. I can't speak to their effectiveness as far as trying to tuck a sheet when the mattress is held up in the air with a spring, but some people like them. They also make a wedge that you can slide in. It's called the Easy Bed, I believe, and you just use your hip to slide it in between the mattresses, and it causes a space so you can tuck sheets under. So there are a lot of things that you can utilize if you take the time to look into it and then provide the training for your staff. Slip strips and falls. So the biggest thing that I tell people when I go out on site is non-slip shoe policy is huge. Just because you tell people to wear non-slip shoes, if they're wearing tennis shoes, that's not necessarily a non-slip shoe. So there are all sorts of tennis shoes that don't meet the definition of non-slip. So enforcing the rules for an actual non-slip shoe that meets the standards, and I'm not a part of Shoes for Crews. I have no involvement in that, but a lot of people have a lot of success using that program. Shoes for Crews will allow your employees to purchase shoes through you, and that can be deducted out of their paycheck over a couple paychecks. You can supplement part of that if you want, but you have a much higher success rate in staff wearing and using non-slip shoes as far as statistically getting them using the Shoes for Crews. Back of the house, just walking through and making sure that things are picked up. So every employer's workplace storage is at a premium. So you're trying to set things and stack things and use your inventory as best you can, but things get put in places where they shouldn't be. Cords get strung across aisleways, things get spilled. Just taking the time or having a manager or yourself walk through and look for these specific things. Because it's easy to walk through the back of a kitchen and just not even notice them. So you got to kind of be aware of what you're looking for when you walk back there. In the laundry of housekeeping and things like that, one of the things that I love the most are the spring-loaded carts. So they have the regular push cart that you load all your laundry into, but they have a false bottom that basically, as it gets filled up with wet towels, it goes to all the way to the base. As you start pulling things out, it raises up. There's a lot of injuries from bending over all the way at the waist and grabbing those heavy wet towels and trying to get them out. So anytime I go through, that's one of the first things that I suggest. Put a spring-loaded bottom in all your carts there. And then in the kitchen, if you drill holes in the bottom of your garbage cans, the bottom inch, you use a drill, just drill a few holes. When you have a full garbage can with heavy items or wet things that just kind of really creates a suction in the can, you grab that bag, pull it up, you won't have the suction if you drill those holes at the base of the garbage can. It's got to be at the base, otherwise if it's up higher on the sides, you'll still get suction. But just one of the things that I've seen that works. Burns is a tough one in the kitchen because there's all sorts of hot things all the time. So one of the main things I see a lot of is people using just rags as hot gloves. I don't recommend that because it's not intended for that purpose. And a rag doesn't necessarily protect the hand. It could be folded in a weird way where one portion is not as thick. So I just say if you can have as many of the oven mitts or hot gloves, hot pads around, make sure people are aware of them. Train people not to throw things into the fryer with an abundance of ice crystals because that just creates splatter. And that kind of goes along with slip strips and falls. If you do have oil splatter, have somebody clean up every hour or so in the kitchen when you have a busy area because that oil splatter really can cause a mess. We had one unfortunate event with an employer where they were using a spray can of grease and they set it behind the fryer and it fell in to the fryer and nobody noticed it until it exploded and it shot hot grease all over, I think, 10 employees in the kitchen. And then some of them had to go to the harbor view. So you're not allowing any of the spray aerosol pressurized cans near the fryer. It seems like common sense, but you get busy and people just put things where they feel like. So those are just a few things to think about. If you have specific issues, if you're seeing injuries and you have specific questions, talk to me after. So I'm going to talk about injury causation. So why are injuries happening? This is just one theory. There are many. But this theory is that there are four states: rushing, frustration, fatigue, and complacency. Four states of mind, basically. And if you're in any of those four state of minds, then your likelihood of creating one of these errors is much higher, which can then increase the risk of an injury. So if I'm, fatigued because I was up all last night with a crying child, and I show up at work and I'm supposed to be prepping, 10 totes of onions, so I'm chopping and I'm super tired and my mind's just not on the task, it puts me at risk of cutting myself. Or if I'm angry from an argument I had from the other day and I'm rushing through the back of the house and I'm putting myself in the way of other people and causing collisions. So these are all just things that if you're seeing employees and you can tell that they're in one of these state of minds. So they're rushing around, they're frustrated, they're fatigued, they're tired, whatever. They're just not their head's not in the game. The whole point of me talking about this is to pull them aside and say, take a few minutes or take a minute, get collected, bring yourself back to whatever you need to do to get back in your head into the game so that you're not going to make one of these mistakes and get injured. Because I don't know about yourselves, but if I look back at most of the injuries that I've had, or a lot of them that I've dealt with, I can pretty much say that 90%, 95% of them, one of these was playing into it a little bit. So it's just something to keep in mind if you see people that are acting unusually, to pull them aside and basically try to get them back on track. These are some prevention and leadership strategies that I talk about when I go out on site. So new team member safety orientation, it's actually a requirement by the state through LNI that every new employee get a safety orientation. And there's a lot of templates out there, check sheets that you can just fill out. But there are 7 main points that are required to go over, and then there are a number of other things that you should go over. So, how to report injuries is huge. How to report unsafe conditions. The proper use and care of their personal protective equipment for the job that they're doing. Emergency evacuation procedures. And then if they're working with chemicals, that's required that you go over that information as well. But beyond that, if they're working with a slicer, they need to be trained on how to use the slicer. If they're, climbing a ladder, they have to be trained on how to climb a ladder. Just because someone was hired on and they've climbed 1,000 ladders doesn't mean that you're good, because as an employer, you are responsible for the training that they receive and to ensure that they are, fully aware of what's required. So this came into play a lot when I worked for Labor and Industries as an inspector, because somebody would get hired on as a maintenance person, let's say, and they had 30 years of maintenance experience before they came on with this company. And they fell off a ladder, and I'd go out and I'd do an inspection and I'd do an interview, and I'd say, so when did you get trained on how to use a ladder? And they said, well, nobody trained me. I've climbed ladders my entire life. I was in construction for 30 years. Okay, well, did your employer ever teach you how to climb the ladder safely on this job? And they'd say no. And that's a problem, because as the employer, you are responsible for training them adequately. You don't know what training they've received. Even if they say they've been trained, you want to make sure that they have the training that you provide them. So whatever the hazards are that they're going to be exposed to, you should train on it. Continuous employee safety training. So this kind of dovetails off of the new hire orientation. Just because you've had someone on staff for 10 years doesn't mean that you stop training them, because statistically, most injuries happen in the first 6 months of employment, but injuries still happen later on in your career, and you want to make sure that people are getting refreshed on the things that could injure them and the steps that they should be taking to prevent that. So monthly safety meetings or quarterly safety meetings, refresher trainings, things like that. Teaching your managers basically, or supervisors, to be leaders versus managers. So I heard a quote that managers hold us accountable, leaders teach us to hold ourselves accountable. And I've always liked that, because Going out and just barking orders at people and telling them what to do doesn't tell them why they should do it or why it's important or how to do it necessarily. So if you're teaching your staff to correct unsafe behaviors by explaining what the hazard is, explaining why we do it this way, and that they care and that you don't want them to get hurt, it goes a lot farther. Daily safety check-ins, and this is geared more towards new employees because, like I said, majority of the injuries happen in the first 6 months of employment. And when you have a new employee, they're trying mostly, hopefully, they're trying their best to impress their new employer, and they don't want to look like they have questions. They don't want to look like they don't understand. So pulling them aside at the end of a shift and basically opening up to them and saying, tell me, if there's anything that we need to go over again. Is there any questions you have? Is there anything that you think we could do in a different way that would be better? Because they're also a new set of eyes, and so you can use their information. But basically, pulling them aside and saying it's basically okay for them to have questions is a good thing to do, because a lot of times they do, but they're afraid to ask. Lead by example. So this is pretty self-explanatory, but if you're going to walk through the back of the house and there's non-slip shoes are required, you should be wearing non-slip shoes as well. If you're in an area that's loud and you have to wear hearing protection, you should be wearing hearing protection. If the employees see you not following the rules that you're trying to enforce, then they're going to think, well, it's not important. If they're not going to do it, I don't have to do it. So positive recognition for positive recognition for good safe behavior. We don't positively recognize unsafe. So if you see someone that's doing something that's correct, they're wearing their personal protective equipment, especially if it's an employee that you've had a hard time, you've had to remind them, pointing out, thank you I see you're wearing your cut gloves, I really appreciate that. Pointing that out, it goes a long way, because I dealt with a lot of employers and their employees when I would do inspections with L&I, and they would tell me stories about how they get harassed by their employer to do this all the time and wear the hearing protection or whatever it is, and then when they finally do it, it's like it never comes up again, which in theory it shouldn't have to, but a lot of times employees feel better when they get recognized for doing what they're supposed to be doing. So pointing that out makes people feel better. It encourages them to do it in the future. And then addressing unsafe behaviors. This is probably the biggest thing. So if you're going to walk past a hazard, what does that tell to other employees? So if I walk past a guy that's on the top rung of a ladder, and somebody sees me walk past it as an owner, that registers with them as that act is okay, and that either that act is okay or the employer doesn't care. So if you see something that's unsafe, stop and address it immediately. Don't walk past it and think you'll come back to it. Stop and talk to them and explain why it's not safe, what you should be doing, and why. So one thing I didn't touch on is when you're doing your training, documentation is huge. So the mantra with labor and industries, and I'm sure many other government organizations, is if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So I can't tell you how many times I did employee interviews, and I would say, so did your employer train you on these hazardous chemicals that you're using? And they would say, well, I don't know, I got a lot of training, And then I'd talk to the employer and they'd say, yeah, we just trained them on hazardous chemicals yesterday, and here's the outline that we went over. I mean, it's amazing how much the training can get lost in the fray. So having the documentation that shows that you did it is going to save you a lot of time and potentially money in the long run if you can show that. Uh-oh, I think I froze up. I'm frozen. I think that, oh wait, so the last slide that I have is some things that you need to take back with you. Every employer should have an accident prevention plan, and that's basically your safety manual that talks about what the training that you're going to provide to your employees as far as the hazards that they're exposed to, how they're going to report injuries, all the different safety things. That all goes into your accident prevention plan, and every employer should have one. Safety committee. So if you have over 10 employees, you need to have an actual committee, and you choose how many people are on the committee. It has to be equal management and to hourly staff. So if you have 3 managers on there, you need to have 3 hourly employees, and then you have a chairperson. And you get to choose how frequently you meet, but it is required that you have meetings. I recommend monthly. Some people prefer quarterly, and you document those meetings, and then you keep them for a year. Because if L&I shows up on your site, they're going to ask for your safety committee meetings. If you have less than 10 or less, you can do safety meetings, and it's not a committee. You just have everybody show up at the same time and have a safety meeting. Hazard assessment for personal protective equipment. Basically, this is a document that every employer is supposed to do for each work area in your facility. So for your laundry, let's say you go in there and you determine these are the hazards that my employees are exposed to, X, Y, and Z. And then these are how I'm going to protect them with training, personal protective equipment, all these different things. And then you sign and date it, and it's, that makes it certified. And you're supposed to do this for each work area, identifying all the hazards and the personal protective equipment that employee needs, and then you keep a copy of it. And you use that to train your staff on what the hazards are for their job when they get hired on. So it's a very useful tool, but a lot of people don't have them because they don't realize that it's actually required by state that you should have that. So, and if you need a template, we actually have one that we can provide that has a lot of the hazards that are common to this industry. So talk to me afterwards. Hazardous chemical communication plan, that's just dealing with chemicals. If you have chemicals, you have to have a plan. You have to have training. You have to provide personal protective equipment, which is usually goggles, and not glasses, but actual like high school lab goggles. And you need to usually have an eye wash. So I've never been into a restaurant or a hotel that didn't need an eye wash, and the handheld bottles that you see in the green little wall-mounted thing does not count as an eye wash. So it has to provide 15 minutes of hands-free flow at 0.4 liters per minute. So it's got to be something more substantial. Cut prevention program is great if you're using knives, something that you should look into, and then documented training. Things to look for when you go back, really, clutter. Going back through, looking for hazards that people can slip and trip over. Wet floors, greasy floors, torn anti-fatigue mats. Non-slip mats and anti-fatigue mats become huge obstacles when they get worn out and the corners curl up or they get a tear in them. Just replace them. Don't try to fix them. It's not worth it. You'll have slips and trips. Making sure there's no grease on the floor near where the fryers are, so a clean schedule, every hour, 2 hours, however you want. Using a detergent to break down that grease. And then making sure that everybody has the personal protective equipment they need to do the job correctly. So if they need gloves, if they need oven mitts, if they need goggles or glasses, making sure that they have what they need and know how to use it. And then the last point, storing items. So the heaviest items that you should store between your shoulders and your waist. They call that your power zone. So if you're storing heavy, giant stock pots up above your head and you're trying to yank them down, it's going to put stress on your neck and your back. Or if you're bending down to pick them up off the floor, then that too is hard on you. So trying to store the heaviest items between your shoulders and your waist is a good idea.